Okay, so Article 1, as we talked about, is about Congress or the legislative branch. To legislate means to write or to make law. And so a Congress is just a term for meeting, a gathering of some sort. They had a Congress under the Articles of Confederation. That was the government. And you'll notice here, and will be important, that Congress has, so here's this kind of middle section, right? This is the U.S. Capitol building. And it has two sides, okay? So you've got the U.S. House of Representatives and the Senate. And as I said before, the knowledge that will make you more informed than most Americans is that the House plus the Senate equals Congress. The House plus the Senate equals Congress. So there's the House of Representatives on one side, there's the Senate on the other, and both of those comprise the lawmaking body that we call Congress. Now they're separate, they're different. They have different numbers, they have different purposes, but they have to work together to craft any type of legislation. And then that goes to the president, and the president can sign it and it becomes law, or veto it, meaning reject it and send it back with his or her objections. And it does not become law usually at that point, unless Congress can override it with a 2/3 override of numbers to override a presidential veto, which has happened, but it's rare. So we'll talk about the House of Representatives first, or just the general statement of the Constitution here. It says that all legislative powers herein granted shall be vested in the Congress of the United States, which shall consist of a Senate and a House of Representatives. So if you know that, you're ahead of most Americans, because most Americans think, okay, well, there's Congress and there's the Senate, which is wrong. It's that there's a Congress, which is two-chambered, okay? Or it's sometimes called bicameral, meaning there's two chambers on this thing that we call Congress. And just to demonstrate some of the constitutional importance of Congress, Congress receives the most attention in the Constitution. So Article 1, dealing with the legislative branch, has over 2,000 words in it, about 2,200 words in it. And that comprises about 52% of the Constitution. So this means that over half of the Constitution is talking about Congress. It's talking about the legislative branch. The presidency, Article 2, the executive branch, only has 1,025 words and is only 23% of the overall Constitution. And so it's about half the amount of constitutional attention that is given to Congress. And then Article 3 is the Supreme Court, 377 words. When I have to write, I'm in a class that we write on a discussion board, and the requirement of the discussion board, one of them is that your posts have to be about 500 words, just to put in perspective, which isn't very long. But 377 words, meaning the Supreme Court comprises about 8% of the total Constitution. And then there's other articles that deal with some other things that are fairly short as well. But you can see clearly what had the most focus of the framers. The Philadelphia Convention spent most of their time talking about the powers of Congress. And they had a lot of things to debate because this would be a lawmaking body. This would be able to tax people. This branch, as it turns out, would be able to send people to war. It would be able to basically be the starting point of all federal governmental actions. So it's a very significant branch, and it's a very powerful branch. All the branches are powerful in their own way, but we see that Congress is kind of the starting point, and in a lot of ways, according to the Constitution and even a lot of history, is it can bring a lot of accountability as well because of the nature of its constitutional powers. Now, usually we focus mostly on the president today, or the presidency or executive agencies and stuff, which makes some sense because this branch has grown in its power and influence. But Congress is still the one where money comes from, where funding comes from. And so it still has potential to be constitutionally powerful. George Washington, I'll have to find the quote for this, original source of this quote, but George Washington said that the House of Representatives is like a teacup and the Senate is like the saucer, okay, which is this little plate. And why he said that is the House is supposed to represent the people. It's even called the People's House sometimes. And it is supposed to be more democratic. It allows people to be in there younger. It allows for, it's less formal. People are there only elected for 2 years at a time. So they're there for a shorter period of time. And there's more people. So this is supposed to be the kind of branch that has less temperament, is more wild. It holds the hot tea. And then it's supposed to be kind of calmed down by the Senate, which is supposed to be the more aristocratic branch. And if we were here, I would have this displayed on the board, maybe do some drawing and writing over this stuff. And then we would talk about how this is the more aristocratic branch. You have to be older. You have to be 30 to be in the Senate. You can be 25 to be in the House. And so you have to be 30. You're there for a 6-year term. You're there longer. It's more collegial. It's more formal. And so these branches are supposed to work in tandem to compete with one another, but also to collaborate with one another in order to craft legislation, which is a fairly difficult process. And one of the things we'll look at is the Schoolhouse Rock video of how a bill becomes a law. And I'm going to talk through that a little bit because the process is a lot more difficult than when people think. Now, a few years ago, my family, my immediate family, parents, sister, and then my little bit of extended family, my uncle's family, which includes my cousins, my aunt, we went to Washington, D.C. for the first time. So I've, taught government stuff for a lot of years. And then we finally got to go to Washington, D.C. And we went to Philadelphia. We went to lots of different places, Maryland, and but the focal point was seeing Washington, D.C. and seeing George Washington's house and all sorts of stuff like that. And I went back one more time, but just flew to a hotel for a conference in, I think, 2019. But anyway, and to take a tour of the Capitol building, you have to go through your state, your district, representative. So we have the state of California, and it's broken down into 53 districts. And then we have ours out here, which includes Palmdale, Lancaster is actually in a different district, Palmdale, Acton, Agua Dulce, Santa Clarita, and I think one more area, but we're kind of on that side. And at the time, so you had to go through your representative's office to take a tour of the Capitol, and then an intern would give you a tour of the Capitol building. And at the time, that was Steve Knight. And you can see I'm smiling here, not because I'm in the presence of a politician, but because I have a Diet Pepsi. I was like, happy about that. And so anyway, and we went, and Steve Knight was actually there. And he's like, oh, you come in and talk to us. And he's been here. He's spoken at our school and stuff. And I'm not making, a statement politically for or against Steve Knight because he was replaced by Katie Hill. And then she had some other things going on, some scandals and things going on in her personal life where she stepped down, and then they had another election. So he's not anymore. But my point of this is not just to show you pictures from my vacation, but to show you that this guy brought us in and talked to us, not just because he was a nice guy, he may be, he was personable to us, but also because he had in his room 8 voters from his kind of hometown. He lives out here in Palmdale. My uncle and family, this is my aunt and my cousin, they live in Santa Clarita. My other cousin and uncle are behind the camera. So he has now 8 voters from his hometown. So that was something that he wanted to pay attention to, I'm sure, was people who were there and were from Palmdale and Santa Clarita, because he's supposed to represent us. Now, again, we've talked about political representation. Can anyone really, whether they're Steve Knight, Katie Hill, or someone else, can they really represent the people of Palmdale, of Santa Clarita? But that's their goal, is he's not supposed to represent the United States, or anyone else in this position is not supposed to represent the United States. They're not supposed to represent the American people. They are not supposed to represent the people of California. They are not supposed to represent their political party. They are supposed to represent the voters from their district, which is us in this district. So let's talk a little bit about how the House works. Okay, House of Representatives. This is the only part of the constitutional government that is truly democratic. Okay, this is the only area where it really conforms to a democracy, in that it's even so still a representative democracy. It is not direct democracy where you're voting for policy. So it's like when people want America to be a democracy, they need to understand the constitutional government does not work that way on purpose. Now, the House is based on what is called proportional representation. And what I'm going to add in here is that is based on the population of state. Plural, states. Which means this: California has a lot of people. So California has 53 representatives. Montana does not have a lot of people. Montana has 1 representative. Right? So there's some differences there. This is one of the issues that was debated at the Philadelphia Convention, was that should states with more people get more representation in the federal government? And that appears to make sense at first. However, that may be a threat to the self-government of the states. And here's why. Because when you look at a state like Rhode Island, which had been governing itself since the Revolution as an independent country, to sign up for a program where bigger states are going to get more representation and therefore have more power means that little Rhode Island may be at a disadvantage, and that their state sovereignty may be sacrificed in that type of system. So they said, no, all the states should be represented equally. And so this is this debate at the federal convention. It's not really about big states versus little states so much as it is about state sovereignty versus national sovereignty, whether the state governments will continue to self-govern or the national government will have power over the states. And the Constitution debated this out, and this is one of those areas of compromise. But again, compromise can sometimes be a good thing, like you came up with something that satisfied the parties that disagreed. But on the other hand, sometimes you have to choose one or the other. And this may be one of those areas in the Constitution where they should have chosen one way or the other, because the House of Representatives is proportional. Bigger states with more people get more representation, but the Senate is all equal. Every state gets 2 senators, no matter its size. But doing a hybrid like that runs into the problem of the fact that in practice, the bigger states with more population still gain more power because you've tried to do it both ways. So it kind of arguably undermines both systems. And so they're intended to represent the people of each state. And what I mean there is, I'm gonna put a caveat because the Senate represents the states too, but I'm gonna say within districts. Because this is a division of the state that what I mean overall is they are the people's house, but they represent the people of the states within districts. Okay. Now the House of Representatives are chosen every 2 years by the people of the state. It's a democratic election. We vote for these representatives every 2 years. So they're not there very often. Now there's no term limit. Somebody can continue being elected every 2 years in perpetuity, meaning going on as long as they wish to continue running and people continue voting for them and electing them. So that's the same with the Senate, except the Senate is 6 years. So now there's the question of term limits. We have term limits for the presidency, 2 4-year terms. That's it. Then the person cannot be the president any longer. Should it be that way for the House and the Senate? Because there are some people who have been senators who keep getting reelected, who have been senators for decades. In addition to that, if you look up today, didn't look this morning, but if you look up today, what is Congress's approval rating? So like we think of, okay, well, the president has an approval rating and that's the one you hear about, but Congress has an approval rating too. And usually it's 80% negative and 20% thinks Congress is doing a good job. So it's easier to criticize, certainly, and everybody kind of loves to hate on Congress. But I'm thinking if that's the case, how come we don't get rid of 80% of the representatives and replace them with somebody better? Well, often people like their representative, but they hate Congress overall. And some of the things I talked about the other day about people feel that they're not getting representation, which is partially true in terms of the size of America in relation to the size of Congress, especially the House, which is only 435 people. So you can be pretty young to join Congress. You can be 25 years old. You have to be a US citizen for 7 years. So you can be from somewhere else. You don't have to be born in the United States, but you had to be a citizen and hold that citizenship for 7 years. And then a resident of the state represented when elected. So if I ran for the House of Representatives for certain district for California, I would have to live in California at the time I was elected. I could move afterward, but I can't. There have been times where people have lived somewhere else and had an address maintained in the state where they were elected, and they weren't really living there. But part of the reason of the House of Representatives is they are supposed to know their district. They're supposed to know their own hometown really well and be able to represent them as the people of their state and the American people as a whole. So they're supposed to know what's going on in their district. The negative side of that is that, or potentially negative side of that, is you bring in a lot of very specific local concerns that don't affect the United States as a whole, but those become the kind of negotiating items that people include, and that ends in order to get compromise on certain laws and bills and those type of things. And that ends up costing us as the taxpayer because we end up paying for a lot of very specific things all over the country, and they end up paying for a lot of specific things only relevant to Palmdale or different areas that it comes from the federal government. And so that can add up in terms of spending. Okay. Just something to clarify, this isn't in the Constitution anymore, but it's the 3/5 compromise. And people often misunderstand this, thinking that the Constitution said that Black people or that slaves were 3/5 of a person. And maybe by implication, you could get that. But what the Constitution at the time had to deal with was this issue of non-voting peoples. How do you count and represent people who don't vote, which would include slaves at the time? Because remember, most, if not all of the states were slave states at the signing of the Constitution and the implementation of the Constitution. So you have this compromise, but obviously slavery is more concentrated in the South and other regions of the country, more so than in the northern states that would eventually become free states on their own in a few years. So how do you count non-voting populations? Okay, so let me give an example. Yes, it would include slaves, but women couldn't vote. So non-voting peoples would include women. Children couldn't vote and still can't. So should it include children? People who are handicapped in some way where they cannot participate in voting, that type of thing. Those are all people who live within the state and are affected certainly by the government of the state and are people who reside there, but they can't vote. But they do count as part of the population that gets represented. And so the 3/5 compromise was compromised between two things. The slave states said slaves should count because they're people living in our states. Because that the more people you had, the more representation you get in the House of Representatives. The free states, or the ones that would become free states that didn't have as many slaves, said, no, you don't get to count property as people for the sake of representation. That's slave representation. That doesn't count. And so a lot of times people think that the slave states were the ones that were arguing that the slaves shouldn't count for representation and that the free states were saying that the slaves should count for representation. But it's actually the opposite. The slave states want the slaves to count for representation because the more people that get counted in your state, the more power you have in the House of Representatives. Therefore, the more power you have in the US government. And so this affected all states, and the northern states did not want to count this because they knew that they didn't have as many slaves, but the northern states would have significantly more immigration, so they would actually get more in the House than the slave states. Now, a lot of times people infer from that. So what they came up with, which is not a good thing necessarily, but what they came up with was, okay, for every 5 people of those populations, of the non-voting populations, you get to count 3. So they gave them some representation. Now, people said, okay, well, this means black people only got 3/5 of a vote. They couldn't vote. So that's not true. They said black people were 3/5 of a regular person. That's not what it's saying, because look here, it says 3/5 of all other persons. The Constitution calls them persons. Now, what they did was still arguably not good, but we need to understand it truthfully and understand it in the context of what is actually being said so that we can criticize it properly. So when people say, and you'll go and, if you take any other history classes, you'll have somebody saying, a history professor doesn't know what they're talking about, rattling these things off, saying, yeah, well, the Constitution said that black people were 3/5 of a person, they get 3/5 of a vote, they don't count as real people, all this stuff. When that's not actually quite what the Constitution's saying. It's really more about how do you count non-voting populations in your state? And this is how they came up with a compromise. And it was the northern states that had less slavery that didn't want the slaves to count at all, and the slave states that wanted to count them because it would mean more power in the government. But this issue of representation and competition for the federal government in 2 parts of the country is going to continue to forward that division. And the Constitution and the federal government kind of brings together a situation that allows that movement towards civil war to happen. It facilitates the conflict because now sections of the country are competing for power in the federal union. And if the one side wins over the other, they are afraid of being dominated, though they want to control and dominate the other side. Okay, so we talked about this. Okay, last thing here. Originally, the proportion was every 30,000 people in a state meant that you got another representative in the House. So it's supposed to be proportional. That's not true anymore, but that was the original formulation. And the Constitution even said that every state would have at least 1 representative, which means some states may even be less than 30,000 people in their estimation, or maybe between 30,000 and 60,000, right? So they have 1 representative. So every 30,000 people in a state, they get another representative. So they would continue to grow, but this was Madison's formulation. It's no longer true. They capped it in the 1920s or 30s at 435. They locked it in that this is what the states were going to get. And so they shuffle it around every once in a while, but it's going to stay at this number. So California has 53. Montana has 1, but that's no longer the 1 to every 30,000. Now the question we've talked about a little bit as well is, does the House need to be bigger? The population that I looked up this morning of the United States is 331 million people. The United States is huge in terms of its population. The American eligible voters is over 200 million. Or eligible to vote. The registered voters is over 146 million. And yet, to represent all of us Americans, In our districts, as the American people, we get 435. Now, remember my problem with saying, okay, well, if we did 331 million and we, divided that up, and we did one in every 30,000, what that would end up being is we'd have a House of over 10,000 representatives. And that may sound good, but remember the impractical to impossible facilitation of that type of government when you have a meeting with 10,000 people. So 435 is difficult, but a lot of people have estimated that's about right for a legislative body to be able to get things done. However, as America grows, this means that we get, with every year, less and less representation, which means the promise of the Constitution that we are a republic becomes questionable, of whether we're a republic or simply an oligarchy, because we don't have a government that could represent us. And if we did have a government with representatives the size of which could represent us, it would be a government that wouldn't be able to function at any realistic level. So, significant problem for the United States in terms of us being represented and really being a republic.